My name's Sam Fall, Product Marketing Manager at Paddle, and I'll be chairing today's discussion. Today we're talking about tackling the growing pains of your design software company. Joining us to share their experiences, I'm pleased to welcome CEO of Demio, David Abrams, and Chief Customer Officer and co-founder of Paddle, Harrison Rose. Both leaders have worked with thousands of SaaS companies and also have first-hand experiences dealing with the pain of growing their own SaaS companies from the ground up. Via his SaaS Breakthrough podcast, David's interviewed dozens of leading lights in the SaaS world to encourage them to share how they overcame common challenges to build successful businesses. Today, we'll be asking David and Harrison to share their insights and advice for growing design software businesses for your benefit and interest. We expect to cover a lot of ground over the next hour. However, if you have any questions that you wanted our panelists to answer, which we don't cover, please tweet us at Paddle HQ. Gentlemen, hello.
Hey Sam,
hey,
great to be here.
Very pleased to have you both. So I guess I wanted to start by asking about growth. SaaS companies can grow in a few different ways. David, which approaches do you think are most relevant to design software companies?
So I think this is a complex question, as many of the questions we'll talk about today are, right? Like there's just so many different types of companies, different types of products to offer. But right now, I think the current belief system that I have based on like our own company and just hearing from the SaaS Breakthrough podcast is that there's often this mistake made early on with SaaS companies putting too much emphasis just on growth and acquisition before other important and critical metrics. And it's easy to kind of fall in love with this idea of that growth for growth's sake. I think there are some really important things to think about for a SaaS company, which is, define a specific niche, a specific industry or segment to create your product for, and then truly understand the needs and frustrations of that customer. Some of the other metrics that are critically important are things like churn or customer usage, stickiness, and value of your product, right? So to understand those things, you really want to speak to your ideal customers, to the users, try to get a deeper understanding of the real solutions that you're trying to solve for those customers. And the deeper you can solve those problems, the better your product will be, and expansion will almost organically occur. And the great thing about SaaS is once you kind of have some growth starting and you have a valuable product, you'll get organic growth from referrals, word of mouth, just market opportunity. And once you kind of get into that opportunity where you're saturating the market, you have a valuable product that's solving a great problem, then maybe you want to look at new expansion opportunities, maybe moving into a new market or, creating a new sub product, whatever that is. You just want to go through the process of always trying to be valuable first and understanding that customer to solve the underlying metrics that are most important.
Yeah,
Harrison, what's your
echoing
view?
David's point to start, I think are really important. Like, don't be thinking about how you can increase growth rate until you deeply understand your customer kind of inside and out. You've got a track record of solving their problems, but equally, once you're acquiring those customers, if you've got a churn problem, let's be fixing that before anything else. I think once these things are true and you're thinking about how you can step on that next growth lever, we're seeing a lot of different software companies and design companies adopt some different approaches as to how they can actually accelerate that growth. So some will look to kind of further monetize their existing product through things like paid upsells, perhaps, or something along those lines. Others will look to improve performance by entering a new market. That could be a new geography or perhaps a new industry. And others will look to move maybe upmarket, so increasing the size of the customer it is that they're actually working with. Now, the biggest companies eventually do all of those things. In design specifically, we've seen most companies reach a good size, a kind of a self-serve billing model. They've got a pretty repeatable method of acquiring customers and they're sticking around. And then the way in which they're accelerating their growth, or the area in which we're seeing them have the biggest impact, is that they start to notice that users within large companies are using their products as individuals. This is evidence to those software companies and those design apps that it's kind of evidence to them that they have champions within organizations and that their product is meeting some sort of professional need, if that makes sense. And it's at that time that they realize that better servicing those customers who want to use their product in a professional capacity could really be the thing that accelerates their growth. And it's the design companies that are both serving individuals, but also businesses and maybe design agencies that we're seeing growing the fastest at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you, Harrison. Let's talk about sales. What do you think is the right time to set up your first sales team? Is a sales team even needed for SaaS nowadays? David, what do you think?
I think from our experience, we haven't had to create a sales team yet. We don't have the need yet to do it. And I think that's more relevant for the level of our pricing, our ARPU, our average revenue per user, and our LTV, our lifetime value, which is relatively low in the scheme of the SaaS world. However, if you are a design company or a SaaS company with a higher price point, longer sales cycles, you have an increased LTV or a higher ARPU, you may specifically want to build out an STR team, sales teams that can help kind of manage that process. We are becoming more and more self-serve in SaaS, but a lot of those self-serve companies are, again, on the lower side of ARPU and LTV. And I don't know if there's ever going to be like that quote unquote perfect time for a sales hire, but my biggest suggestion kind of going through this process would just be to make sure you don't hire anyone until you are confident in what the customer's problems are, who that ideal customer is, understanding of the sales cycle, so that when you actually start to bring on SDR teams and salespeople, you have the knowledge to show them how to do this through value-driven sales. And I think a lot of what the kind of lower end of the market now, kind of that self-serve SaaS is starting to do, is move sales teams in more like this customer success role, which means that instead of just like pushing for acquisition and just the sales numbers, you're really trying to reinforce things like product knowledge, customer use cases, increasing the customer value so they understand what they're getting out of products. And that really just helps to then increase that ARPU and that LTV because people are understanding more about the product as they get into it.
Harrison, is that consistent with the way you see things?
Yeah, I think so.
What's your view?
I think that the thing that I'd echo there is that evolution in what these salespeople look like. To echo David's point, is really interesting in that these people shouldn't be solely focused on acquisition, but also actually increasing the value that a potential customer is going to get out of both interactions with you and out of using the product. I think the really interesting thing for me that's going on in conversations about whether people need sales teams is that so commonly folks are super resistant to this at first. There's that understanding piece, I think, that's important early on that David was talking about before you invest in this. And I think for me and for most SaaS companies, sales people are a means to kind of accelerate growth. We've seen this at places like Slack, which was super resistant to sales, and I think published like articles saying they'd never hire a salesperson, and that's just not true. They now have an absolutely huge sales team, for example. But those prerequisites that David talks about are exactly right in terms of you need to have an understanding of who your customers are and the value of delivering them before you do so. And then very importantly, that average revenue per user or ARPU and the contract value needs to be high enough for you to actually get a return on investment on the sales effort. There isn't a magic number here, but by any means, I think most of the design companies and software companies we spoke to are investing in this heavily and have an average contract value. So the average amount a customer is due to pay over a year, annual contract value of around $5,000 and up. But honestly, that's not going to be true for everyone. It's just an estimation there. Remembering that in order to achieve that quite high figure, you're often selling many seats or many licenses into this organization at once. And once you're kind of ready with those preconditions, you've got some steady growth already, you're wanting to accelerate that via sales, and you think that through sales you can reach a kind of annual contract value of 5K and up. We've noticed that software companies and design companies specifically actually either get kind of dragged up market and forced into sales and thus hiring salespeople, or they're more proactive about this in their go-to-market strategy and actually seek out selling some of these larger deals where you are going to get the return on investment in hiring salespeople.
So with a sales team in place or not, how do you know when your prospects are ready to buy? I mean, what kind of intent signs do you look for in your marketing or sales? David, what do you think?
I think most advanced companies are actually looking to set up specific KPIs or key performing indicators that designate when a company or a prospect has gone from an MQL, which is a marketing qualified lead, to an SQL, a sales qualified lead. And I think when a prospect becomes an SQL, they then move to the sales team to get on a call to pursue the sale. I think the key thing here is understanding the education and level of awareness levels that MQL has to become an SQL. And I think over time, you're able to look at numbers and review data to see who those MQLs were to become SQLs. And I think there's a variety of tools to do this, to measure things like, when do they opt in? What are they looking at? Are they looking at blog posts? Are they reading educational pieces on our website? Have they contacted us? These things kind of give a trail, a queuing line of what they've done in the early stages to give you an idea of where they're at. But when you're just starting this process, especially in SaaS, you don't have that data. You don't know who those people are or what those indicators are. So what we did, and just kind of speaking from our experience, is that we really utilized self-serve demos, right? We had people come in, and I think in the first year we did like 3,000 one-on-one personal demos with prospects and customers. But when doing this, we're able to ask questions, learn from the customers, from their own answers, like what they were looking for, how they found us, what they were searching for, why they set up a demo, the problems that they're looking to solve, more about their company. And we were able to utilize that to aggregate the data that then helped us understand when someone is actually qualified then to get on a call and would be ready for a sale. And then you kind of backtrack that to say, okay, here's the things that we need to know to make sure that they are a qualified lead to jump on a sales call. Because the only problem that you do by putting someone too early in that pipeline is just having someone that's not ready to buy. And then you're utilizing, and kind of, I don't want to say wasting time, but you're utilizing sales resource times when people aren't ready to buy.
I think really speaking to people to understand that buyer journey is the absolute must in the early days. And then as you really get an understanding of what data points or what actions or what takes place during that buyer journey, you can really evolve both your tooling and your understanding around that process. And thinking about Paddle here, similarly, we often talk about that buyer journey in terms of fit data, engagement data, and intent data. So fit data basically determines whether the user in question meets what you might have as an ideal customer profile, so that customer most likely to buy or perfect for your product. So for a design company, this could be they need to have a minimum of 10 designers. Maybe we're more likely to win them if they're based in Europe and they have revenues over $100,000 a year. Maybe you've even seen a correlation in like technographic data. So if they've bought one complementary product, they're more likely to buy your own. This is what we call fit data. Secondly, there's kind of engagement data. So that's how they engage with you. Have they subscribed to marketing emails? Have you met them at an event? And then lastly, the intent data. So tracking whether this person is looking at the pricing page. Have they actually got on that demo that David was just talking about there? This is intent data. If you're running a freemium model, you actually get even a richer data set, if that makes sense, because you can actually see how the user is using your product and really get a deep insight there. But as David says, ultimately it's in tying this data together and measuring someone's kind of fit, engagement, and intent, which determines who you should actually, or who's best to invest your time selling into and who is most likely to buy. I think there's some amazing content that I'm sure we can put in the show notes about kind of these different types of data, which should hopefully guide you guys as you progress through this journey.
So how do you look to maximize your customer conversion when you're growing?
I think most companies have a huge opportunity to actually decrease their CAC, their customer acquisition costs, by increasing that free to paid conversion rates. We're really kind of talking here more freemium or free trial conversion rates, but I think there's a huge opportunity to maximize that conversion. I think many companies underutilize the power of webinars and customer onboarding during the time of either the free trial or the freemium timeline. Once you have a strong understanding of who your ideal customer persona is, you can actually create an engaging and interactive webinar that outlines the specific features and functions that drive the most value for your users. Now, I want to say that this is not a software walkthrough. That's boring. That's not exactly what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about a value-driven webinar that's framing it as an interactive workshop where you can talk about how your product solves the problems that your users have that stop them from becoming a customer. So a big thing to know is that you probably want to have surveys and user calls set up with the users that don't convert. So you can get the real answers on why people aren't converting, figure out where that leak in the bucket is of that customer conversion. And then that webinar and that onboarding is set up to solve those things, value driven, but solving the problems that is causing people not convert. So if you can accomplish this step, you can actually maximize your customer conversion. It reduces that customer acquisition cost. And a lot of times you'll actually see ARPU increase as well, because your users are going to get more value, have a better experience, and just have a longer timeline with your product, and just they'll stay, they won't churn.
Harrison, is that consistent with how you view this point?
Yeah, the point that particularly resonated with me there was that webinars aren't product walkthroughs or product demos. So we've all been to those before, or have been demoed something that isn't related to the pain that we really want to learn about, and they're super painful. And that's a really, really useful takeaway for people, just through experience, for me anyway. Having bought lots of software, I guess, over the years, it's really cool. I think that the other thing to think about here is how you're framing this conversion point as well, from free to paid. And you really need to think about whether this conversion is sales assisted or non-sales assisted. So we had a look at Redpoint Ventures, which are a fantastic VC based out in the Valley, and they produced some fantastic stats on conversion. In a report earlier this year that, again, I'm sure we can put in the show notes, but across the thousands of SaaS companies they surveyed, they saw an average unassisted conversion rate of around 4%. And the assisted conversion rate, which means that if you're being helped by a customer success team that David mentioned earlier, or a sales team, these obviously increase with that human touch up to kind of 15%. And these are really helpful, I think, for people, because these are real benchmarks for you to work towards and consider. And do consider this when you're thinking about that conversion, and the fact that they look very different if there's a salesperson or customer success person involved. Now, if you're looking to improve kind of unassisted conversion rate, so you don't have a sales team, which I imagine is most of you guys out there listening today, we'd advise you to really think about the trial it is that you're offering. But most importantly, offering the right type of trial based on your product. Now, in that same survey that Redpoint ran earlier this year, they saw that time trials are the most popular there, but they did see similarly great performance and conversion with things like usage-based trials. On average, a time trial was converting at the same rate as to whether that was a 7-day trial or a 30-day trial. The actual length of the trial didn't impact performance at all. The thing that we have heard anecdotally from software companies and design companies is that if you bias towards that shorter kind of time trial, and particularly if you're selling into larger organizations, it gives you the ability to engage in a sales conversation and actually extend that trial for them, which can help with conversion rate overall. It's just a little takeaway there. I think the other way in which we've heard you can improve conversion rates here is making these trials card present, and that kind of 2.5x is your conversion rate from free to paid, but obviously does have some other consequences. The actual number of people entering a trial is probably going to reduce there, impacting conversion rates, of course. And the last point that sounds like, David, you spoke about on a previous podcast, perhaps with Price Intelligently, is kind of hyper-local pricing or true localization. And this has a huge impact on performance as well. And I think it's what we're going to be chatting about next.
Yeah, I guess a big factor in conversion is price. Would you both be able to share your best practices for setting up your pricing? And how do you think setting up pricing here differs for design software companies specifically?
Sure, if I have a good answer for design companies specifically, but more so just kind of pricing for SaaS in general, I think like Harrison just said, like Price Intelligently has a ton of great information on pricing. That's all they do is like work on pricing. So they have a lot of good resources there for in-depth discussions. But I just had Patrick on the podcast recently and learned a ton from him. But like the big things is that pricing is something that should consistently be revisited. It's not something that you just set and forget. Hey, we're going to pick a price. That's where we're going to stay. You shouldn't be afraid to change it. It's part of your business strategy, similar to your marketing or your product, right? Constant iterations of it. And it should be really relative to the value your product or service provides. And that, I think, is like kind of the key takeaway. A lot of times I think people come into business and they think of, how am I going to price this? And they look at the marketplace and they look at other service providers and they look at other SaaS companies and they're like, hey, I'm going to price $1 cheaper. They sell their services for $5. I'm going to sell mine for $4. I'm going to get more customers because of that. I'm going to steal their customers. But by doing that, you basically like price yourself down in the market. Really, the goal here should be understanding your ideal customer profile, understanding what your value is to your customers, and then what they're willing to pay for it. And going back to those kind of like one-on-one demos, especially in the early days, one great part of this is that you can actually utilize these to sell and talk directly on those calls to understand your economic viability, meaning what will someone actively pay for this? And the cool thing about this is you can try different price points. You can move up, you can move down, you can even have different pricing pages that are live. I'm not saying split test pricing pages, but you can have different pricing pages live so you can see what are people willing to pay for to find that perfect pricing area. And of course, you can change that later as your value evolves. Your pricing should evolve with it. In the early days, just some advice from our journey. I don't really love lifetime pricing. I know there's some design companies out there that do like some type of like unlimited pricing. I like to think of monthly or annual sales. If you're doing annual sales, you can often do discounts or deals to push those annual plans more. This actually helps, especially if like your average monthly orders is like 7 months before someone churns. If you can get someone on an annual plan, you automatically add more revenue, right? So you can utilize some deals or discounts to push that and really make that a good piece of your pricing. But again, just the key thing I want to say is as your product evolves, make sure you go back and look at the value from that pricing, and that can evolve as well.
Yeah, some of David's points there were super interesting for me, just thinking about the journeys that a number of the design companies we work with have gone on. And the point about David's kind of reluctance to do the lifetime pricing was interesting to me. I think the thing that we've seen most commonly there is that very early stage SaaS companies and design companies too will often start with a very high price point lifetime plan as a means to get cash flows early. But very rarely are you seeing a very well established kind of older kind of market leader still offering those plans. So that tends to be when we've seen them introduced. Whether it's even the right thing to do in the early stages or not is super interesting. And I think the advice there on discounting annual plans, particularly if you have a long or no problems with churn, there is a really, really cool thing to do. I think pricing discussions generally have been interesting at Paddle because this is constantly iterated upon, and all of our sellers come to us all the time asking for suggestions on kind of what's that perfect price point or what should we be doing next. And I think that's because we're in a bit of a unique position as someone powering the e-commerce for SaaS companies out there, in that we see millions of checkouts take place across all of the products on our platform, including design products, every single day, every single month, and just see how things are performing, what's working and what's not. In design companies specifically, we're seeing a real evolution in terms of the steps they go through or the journey they go on with regards to pricing and kind of their go-to-market efforts. So pretty much everyone starts off with this monthly and or annual plan that's sold on a recurring basis. I don't think that's going to be a surprise or contentious to anyone at all listening today. And they then start to optimize the price at which they're selling at. They start to get savvy around their conversion rates and do some of those tests that kind of David was talking about there in terms of different price points on different landing pages, for example. Thereafter, they start to think about what's called true localization, which is thinking about pricing on like a per country basis, considering kind of the purchasing power, the budget, and the competition, and the actual appetite to pay for software in the region. And we've seen specific software sellers triple revenues when reducing prices in emerging markets like Brazil and China, simply because that's the price they're expecting to pay. And obviously they start to convert more customers, albeit at a lower price, but ultimately end off better off for it. Support for things like local currencies and languages is important here too. So that's super important, and they're the kind of the early steps that we see people go through. But the next stage in that evolution, and the kind of biggest driver of revenue we're seeing right now for these design teams is, as we mentioned earlier, is their ability to effectively sell into teams or agencies, or basically selling to groups of people as opposed to individuals. And when you start that, people move away from this pure kind of monthly or annual plan model and start thinking about seats, kind of like a per seat model, and often charging an increasing price per year depending upon the number of users, or sometimes I've seen like projects that you can actually use during that billing interval. And this means that you start to charge more and more for the increased usage of your product. And normally there's a correlation between the value you're delivering and usage, in addition to a correlation between the kind of size of the organization you're selling to and that usage. So it kind of works well and it's fair for everyone. At some stage, the last step in that evolution we've seen is that they actually allow users to self-serve pay for up to, say, 5 users or 5 projects, whatever that looks like for your particular company. Then if you want more than 5 licenses, seats, users, whatever projects, whatever that is to you, they actually put that ability to pay for that amount of seats, say, behind a request a quote or contact us button. And this is linked to the conversation we were having earlier about sales and also conversion. Now, the belief for those companies is that the value of this deal is significant enough that they'll get a return on investment on that sales-assisted conversion that we were talking about earlier. And often, the person who wants to buy 10 seats or whatever it may be could theoretically actually buy 500. And this is a real chance to actually upsell them on the additional value you could deliver if more people within their organization were using your product. They're the kind of steps that we've seen people go through and tactics we've seen in terms of pricing from design companies and what's been working best.
David, you touched on freemium before. How do you feel about freemium being part of your go-to-market strategy? Is it a good tactic to use for initial customer acquisition, knowing that there'll be the hard challenge of turning them to paid customers later on?
I think, like most of my answers, this is a tough one to specifically give like a yes or no answer to. I think it's really determined by the market, your product, service that you're offering, the price points that you're offering, whether you're selling into a team or not, like Harrison just said, which is an incredible idea, and awareness levels of your ideal customer. Really, your decisions need to be made thinking strategically about those things. Each segment of your market may have different fears. They may have different understandings of what a service should look like, whether it's a SaaS company or an agency. They have requirements maybe that get you to a sale, but I ultimately think the best feedback to understand comes from paying customers. What does the data look like? What does it actually look like? In the early days, I would suggest trying to do the manual work of sales, like we mentioned before. Get on those calls, talk to them, get the viability, talk to your ideal customers, get the feedback, and build it out that way. One of the things I'll say just from experience is like when we first started, we did no free trials, and it was just paid. It was just self-serve, pay only, and we saw low conversion rates. So we tried a free trial. Free trial had a credit card required aspect to it. The feedback that we were getting when we were talking to customers, even on demos, on one-on-ones, on sales process, was that people had a fear of lack of trust, and they wanted to get through this ability to have some type of trust in our platform before they even put in a credit card information. So we then switched over to a no credit card required free trial, which just exploded our prospect acquisition, our MQL process, and really just kind of changed things for us as far as customer acquisition went. But that was from listening to just the feedback, just understanding what the market was saying in that market segment. Because if we went to enterprise, it would be a totally different thing. So just, again, knowing your customer is such a critical piece of this whole thing.
Does that make sense to you, Harrison?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think that trust and listening to the customers was a really interesting story there. I think the thing that we neglect to think about, and is super important in this conversation for design companies specifically, is that these aren't impulse purchases for people. Even if you're just buying this for yourself, like typically a design tool is priced at, it's not below $10, for example. And this is something people really think about and consider and want to see value from and trust in. And building that credibility early is really important, and showcasing them to that value that David and I have been talking about a lot of the time is so important and going to help you convert these people from freemium to paid customers. So I'm not surprised within design specifically that this would be super important for people. I think our general view on this is that freemium is a great way to drive a high number of early adopters, increase the actual pool of feedback you're getting from customers on your product, pay more attention to your paid customers than your free, per David's point, but absolutely can drive a high number of users very, very quickly. Ultimately, these folks can be converted into paying customers, and you should perceive that as an opportunity. And then if you're thinking about enterprise down the line, these individuals or these users who've experienced your products can also become champions in larger deals. This model, this freemium model, is what we're seeing from some of the big design products in the market, the likes of Sketch, Marvel, Framer, Figma. And whilst freemium seems like the right idea and there's clear benefits to this, the actual trick is to execute upon delivering the right type of trial, showcasing your value to the extent that you need to during that trial to convert a customer to paid, and executing upon those things is the actual challenge here, I think.
So the SaaS world, and specifically the design software world, is pretty noisy as new companies have been able to launch and expand very quickly due to the latest technological advancements. Are you seeing companies using pricing as a key differentiator? And if so, how can you make sure you're doing this successfully?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And it kind of goes back to an answer I gave before. I think a lot of companies, when they first start out, think of competitive pricing. They're just getting off the ground, and you're just starting your business and you're looking at other design companies out there, and it's easy for us to model, right? Like model after what other people are doing. We call that like the competitive pricing model. So you're either trying to match them or go a little bit under them because it's going to give you faster acquisition. But again, like I said before, it really just starts kind of this race to the bottom in a marketplace. But it really, more than anything, can mess up business economics. Like you may be doing the same amount of work for less money, which means you now have to double acquisition to even have the same profitability numbers. Your scale gets all thrown off. Or then you end up at a place where you realize you have a bunch of users in or a bunch of customers in that you can barely handle. So your workload goes down, your quality goes down. And that can really be, disastrous. And I think a lot of companies get thrown off from the economics, just kind of the short-sightedness of just being in the beginning stages. And it's not a mistake. I think it's just that it's inexperience and it's easy to do. And I think, again, to price effectively, you really have to understand the idea of value-based pricing and how pricing should represent the value that your services provide to your ideal customer. What problems are you actively solving, and what are they willing to pay to get those problems solved? If you're working with a team, it may be totally different than if you're working with like an agency, or if you're working directly with a solopreneur, right? All of those things are different value adds that you're giving to their company. But I think a real win is when you're looking at value-based pricing is like kind of understanding who your segment is, and that you don't have to go to the low end all the time. I think it's an easy place to go. You can think about a segment of the market being some niche and some segment inside of a niche, right? So imagine, I'm just making this up on top of my head, but dentists with over 1,000 clients, and they have a specific need for some design identity. And so you only work with that segment of the market, and your prices are very high to work with these dentists one-on-one because you're offering 4 to 5 proofs that are going through, and then it's going to some specific output, and they need different mediums and placements. So all of a sudden you could be that sole provider that creates a solution for them in that industry or niche, just by differentiating what your value is, and your pricing is equal to that. So you wouldn't price that same service for $37 for the low end of the market that you would for that high end, right? That would kind of mimic the value that you're adding to your ideal customer profile.
What's your view, Harrison?
Yeah, there's some really interesting points raised there, and I think, ultimately, pricing shouldn't be a differentiator, and thinking about just competition in that pricing and undercutting them it is unsustainable and a race to the bottom. I can only echo what David said there. I think that the really interesting point raised during this was that think about the value you're delivering, set a price based on that value. And that value can actually be different depending on which type of customer you're serving at any given time. And that price is probably going to be different too. But ultimately, when considering pricing, there's a lot of different variables to consider. There's a value you're delivering, there's the competition, there's the actual, GDP in the region, the amount they can actually afford to spend on software. And all of these things absolutely need to be considered when setting your pricing. And exactly to David's point, that's really hard in the early days, which is why pricing is iterative and something that you'll change constantly. I do think it's a mistake to exclusively set a price low as a means to differentiate or win customers, because it will be unsustainable. You won't be able to support these users effectively or ultimately run your business. We've had a couple of interesting anecdotes where we've heard sellers actually be outreached to because their users or their buyers didn't think they were pricing high enough, and they were genuinely concerned that the product they loved would go under and people wouldn't be able to support it anymore. So if you're delivering enough value to people, they actually want to give you money. Like, they're using your product every single day and they're getting value from it. They want to pay for it. And so don't be tempted, I think, into just undercutting your competitors and kind of engaging in that race to the bottom, because it's just the wrong way to do it, as easy as it may be.
So just to go a little bit deeper into pricing, how do you price successfully so that your company doesn't become another commodity? I mean, how do you start to really build brand equity?
Well, I think, like you just mentioned, the brand is the key thing here. I think that is one of the biggest moats that you can actively build for your business. A moat could be something like a technology or a unique IP or something specific you're doing, but I'm a big believer in brand. I think features and functions and UI and pricing, like the structure of pricing, those things can be replicated and mimicked. Whenever you're entering a marketplace, there's always going to be like behemoths in there, unless you're like kind of creating your own new industry type of thing. So people can replicate those things, especially with more resources than you. But what can't really be replicated is that unique identity that you can create, the culture, the brand of your business. And a great and easy way to start with that is really content marketing. It's having high quality support, maybe a great user experience, constantly having that iterative product that's continually to be changed based on the real feedback from your customers. Like, just learning to understand them and knowing them more than anyone in the market, and then finding ways to stand out. That can be through like your voice and tone in your copy on your marketing website. That can be in just how your product feels and the prompts. It could be taking a stand on a unique belief system on how things should be done, or the way you want to see business change, or maybe it's just having a unique way to approach a solution. But I think these things really help you to kind of have that unique identity, and people want to be a part of that identity. They want to feel like, hey, I also agree with this stand that you're taking. I like your company because of that. And when you can build that out, you actually can really create something unique that can't be replicated. I think just top of mind, some really great companies that I love and look to for that brand, maybe companies like Drift in their approach, or Wistia or Basecamp, all of which have very unique identities, which we can all relate to in different ways, whether you like it or not.
Harrison, what's your view?
Yeah, I mean, it makes a ton of sense. Like, I'm not sure, as a founder of a design company, you should be thinking about kind of pricing as a way to get commoditized. Like, you should be thinking about building brand, delivering value. Like, it's these things that are make you kind of stand out in the market. I think design companies really lead the way here in building great brands. You look at there's tons of them out there, but just look at the communities that exist around products like Sketch and all the themes and plugins and add-ons that exist for that particular product. But to think about some of the examples that David was just raising there, like Drift, what they're experts at is delivering constant value to the communities around their products and the people using their products, and even people who aren't. And it's that which makes you super successful, like religiously solving problems, delivering value in every single engagement you have with a potential customer, whether that be through content or actually using your product, is what's going to make you stand out in the market, and making people's lives better. Like, that sounds really like, I guess, fluffy, but if people enjoy interacting with you and engaging with you, they're going to remember that experience, and you're going to be much more likely to be successful, I think.
Just touched before on the role of communities. I mean, have you witnessed SaaS and design software companies successfully building communities around their products and then leveraging those communities for future development? Is this something you've tried or something you'd recommend? David, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a community around our podcast. We haven't done one yet specifically around for instance, webinars. But I think a lot of SaaS companies are building great communities and doing well with them, and building those communities first before even building out their product. And they're actually utilizing this to launch their products and to get feedback for an upcoming product idea, learn about the market better, have those conversations. You can actually just build a community around an idea, and then you have kind of this lead source to build into, to kind of growth hack into. I've also seen communities basically being sprouted up after a product's built and you're already going to market. And then that becomes more of a support system, right? Keeping your users engaged, getting feedback, creating new maybe expansion opportunities for you, just learning how to increase value, create more stickiness. And once you have that kind of community feel, that's another moat that you build around your business that someone can't take away. I think the best way to do this is to create a community around a common goal or a common understanding that your users are trying to achieve. So for instance, I think of Drift building a marketing or sales community around that, where people can have the conversations around, how do we increase leads? How do we increase revenue? What are different strategies that would apply here? And again, it's got to be a wide enough topic that keeps people able to have conversations, connect with others, be able to add insights from different perspectives, but it has to be kind of encapsulated in the same niche that would apply for everyone that would be a user for your product.
Harrison, same question to you.
Yeah, I can't emphasize enough that I truly think that it's the design companies that are really leading the way here compared to a lot of others out in the SaaS world. And David's done a great job of touching on some of the benefits of that, particularly how it's a great way to get some support for your product without having to invest a ton of time in that. If you've got a great community and brand and people are talking about your products and helping one another, that's a great thing for you. It becomes a differentiator. It becomes a reason that people actually use your product. So there's so many benefits to this. I think building community around a particular problem or goal that people have is really, really interesting, and it's certainly going to work. But truthfully, we've even seen people just create meetups or events around their actual product when they reach a certain level of adoption. And we know we work with companies like Framer who have meetups all over the world to talk about prototyping and actually making the most out of using their product, and they're super, super successful. So community can be expressed in loads of different ways, whether that be meetups, tutorials, content support systems. But all of these things are hugely beneficial. And David's absolutely right. Build a moat around your product and your business. I think the evolution here that's most interesting to me, really thinking in terms of some of the growth levers that we've been talking about, is how some design companies, and again, they're really leading the way here, are building real communities around their products, but who actually produce content for their products themselves, their SaaS business themselves. So communities who are actually contributing add-ons or extensions, plugins, themes, or whatever it may be around a particular SaaS product. And I think that we're going to see a big wave here in that some of those companies that have some adoption and people creating content around their products will start thinking about how they can kind of monetize that better, not just for themselves, but for the actual content creators too. They're going to think about how they could actually allow some of their users to make the most out of their product by upselling them some of this content. And this is going to be great because, heck, it's free improvements and extensions on what your product was delivering before. Well, there's obviously a need for it because someone's probably built it for themselves and is now selling it to others. And the other great thing here is that you're even empowering people to run their own businesses and actually get a livelihood out of the SaaS app or the product that you've built yourselves, which is really empowering, I guess. And I think the next wave we're going to see in design is software companies who utilize these communities and brands that they've built around their app to actually extend their product offering and actually monetizing that, both creating third-party content and extensions for themselves, but utilizing the stuff that the communities around their apps are building to.
I guess as a final question, I wanted to ask a bigger question on creating a meaningful connection with your customer as you grow. As you start growing your company, in what instance do you look to build a stack of solutions for flexibility versus having a unified solution? I suppose this could be a billing, marketing, or product development platform. In all instances, how do you basically make sure you have a single source of truth when it comes to your customers so you can serve them as smoothly as possible?
Yeah, I think tracking in that tech stack maybe one of the most complex parts of this whole process. And I say complex from like the tactical sense of how does this all work. Obviously, some of the beginning things that we talked about is like strategically the things that you have to think about the most. Right now, there's so many options to choose from I guess the tech stack perspective. And when you're just starting, it can be a little overwhelming to understand like, what do I need? How's this all going to work together? What's it all going to do? I think in the new world of SaaS right now, we have this great integration basis that these SaaS apps are creating, which is that a lot of these apps can connect together pretty well. And platforms like Zapier make it pretty easy to do that. So you kind of have this ability now to pick and choose what's going to work for you. And I think the best answer here is really looking at your budget and really understanding what your business can do. Do I have the ability to pay a premium for a single source solution, or am I bootstrapped and all revenue that I do create, I'm going to need to budget out some money to create a stack of tools, and I'm going to add those tools on as my company grows to get more and more solutions added to my stack. For us, we were bootstrapped, so we kind of went that approach of having these different tools that fit the solutions that we needed. I think if you do have the budget already, having that single source of truth will be really, really helpful. And I think at some level, you're going to have to move there probably, because if you're scaling your company and you're scaling your team, it can be kind of hard to have all of these different platforms with different metrics, and tools like Segment have come out to try to help this process, where you kind of have this distributed stack where all of these different tools are kind of feeding into one tool and then outputting one single source of data. So there definitely is solutions coming out from this, but they're expensive. So sometimes having those single places for everyone just to look at, to say, okay, here's our metrics. Now we can actively measure growth from a single source of truth. This may be the right move. And I only say it may be the right move because I know that sometimes these smaller products that kind of make up a multi-tier tech stack can be really actually helpful, because each one may focus on their specific problem the best. Where a big company is focusing on 10 things, each one is about 90%, and one of the smaller companies could focus on it all the way, really doing some cool things. It's really got to be dependent on what you're trying to solve. Just don't get too overwhelmed by it. Definitely start solving these problems one at a time, and then just making the decisions to expand out as you need.
Harrison, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a really interesting take on things. I think we've certainly, and hear about this a lot, that when design companies or software companies, SaaS companies, reach a certain stage, that the disparate tools that they've cobbled together no longer are fit for purpose. And they're almost spending more time actually keeping those things working well together and trying to get to a point of confidence and source of truth and they start spending too much time and resource on that. That's something we hear over and over again. But on the other hand, when you are a bootstrap company, the thing you have limited time and limited resource. So the thing you need to think about is, how do I actually spend that most wisely? How do I actually deliver the biggest impact I possibly can with the resources that I have today? And when considering whether you need a unified tool, a source of truth, or thinking about your tech stack or infrastructure, generally speaking, ask yourself the question, what should I be spending my time on? What's going to be slowing me down? Or on the inverse, what tooling can I pick that's actually going to allow me to achieve more? And think about this point of value that we've covered over and over again today. Is this tool actually going to make my life better? Is that going to allow me to grow faster? In which case, should I be paying for that? For me, like as a company owner or a founder listening out there, like you should be spending your time building incredible products and experiences that really differentiate yourself from your competitors and deliver the most value you can for your customers. And pick the solution that you're not going to have to invest a huge amount of time managing, because nobody's going to notice that from a user perspective most of the time. And you'll just be sinking resources. Pick a solution which you're not going to have to change often, because those changes are painful. Or even want to tweak, like as you want to experiment with pricing or billing models, pick a solution that's going to grow with you and allow you to move through that growth trajectory as fast as you possibly can. We obviously have some strong opinions on this, given that it's really our mission here to unlock that growth for SaaS companies and provide them the infrastructure they want in order to scale. But this is how I think about things. Don't get to the point of the big company where you've cobbled all these things together and everything is broken. Make your decisions wisely in the early days to think about what's going to be the tool that grows with me, but also going to allow me to focus on the things that are actually going to make my business a success or not.
And that just about brings us to time. David Abrams, Harrison Rose, thank you for taking the time to share your insights.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, David.
It's been a pleasure. And thank you to everyone who dialed in for today's session as well. If you have any questions and wanted to ask our panelists any questions which weren't covered in today's session, please feel free to tweet them at Paddle HQ. We'll do our best to come back on those. And if you're interested to find out about how Paddle can help you achieve the growth potential of your design software business, head to paddle.com where you can book in a chat with one of our experts. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.